Hello again, I'm James Duffy, and I'd like to welcome you back for the final steps of our journey with the Estes 1/48 scale Soyuz booster. By this point, you should have a workbench covered with individual sub-assemblies ready for paint. Over the course of this video, we're going to prime these bits, mask and paint them, apply the decals, and then bring everything together. We'll end up with a great big model that's either ready to fly or ready to spend its days as one of the highlights of your static display collection. The new Estes kit represents a particular Soyuz round, TMA-8, which was launched from the Baikonur Cosmodrome in Kazakhstan on March 30th, 2006. The rocket had a crew of 3 on board, a Russian commander, a US astronaut, and the very first Brazilian astronaut. Their mission took them to the International Space Station, where the Russian and American stayed for 6 months, while the Brazilian returned after a stay of just over a week, presumably to have his wax job refreshed. Before we go too much further, we need to decide what color our Soyuz booster is, gray or green. And the answer to that is, I don't know. I don't know, and neither do you, and we're not going to solve that riddle anytime soon. You could fill a room with Talmudic scholars and have them argue over the question for a century, and you would still not have an answer. Now, why are perceptions of the color all over the map? First, gray is an awfully ambiguous term, both literally and figuratively. On top of that, it's not a color, but rather the absence of color. Add into that the fact that lighting conditions anywhere are widely variable, and also the fact that Soviet color film technology was also pretty terrible. On top of that, every modern digital camera manufacturer uses different color profiles, and some manufacturers even offer multiple color profiles in the same camera if you take the time to read the instruction manual, which most people don't. Finally, the paint color may have been changed at the factory at some point, or even at multiple points. So identifying a simple gray is not so simple. In 2006, I had the opportunity to visit the Baikonur Cosmodrome, the Russian analog to the Kennedy Space Center. And at one point, our group was allowed to enter the facility where Soyuz booster components were stored and integrated. We stood a couple of meters away from factory-fresh, brand-new Soyuz elements and had this very gray or green discussion and came no closer to an answer. Short of placing an actual color analysis tool directly on a Soyuz part, we're on our own. Now, I'll share what I think, and what I think is that the color is a base medium gray with a healthy hint of a pukey green. If you come up with a different answer to the Soyuz color question, I may not agree with it, but I will help you defend it. I've run a number of paint tests using mixes of Tamiya acrylic colors, and these are the results. Just as a pro tip, cheap plastic spoons are great for doing paint tests. Ultimately, I've decided to go with a mix of 2 parts Tamiya Ocean Gray and 1 part of Olive Drab. That's a simple 2-to-1 mix. I'll mix up a healthy quantity of this in a mixing jar because I don't want to run out mid-project, and I anticipate doing more of these kits in the future. Now, if you aren't adept with an airbrush, there are a couple of quick and easy spray can options that I can recommend. If you're looking for a more traditional gray, there's no easier solution than to use Tamiya Ocean Gray RAF spray lacquer. You might also consider the Tamiya Haze Gray or Dark Ghost Gray lacquers. A more green-intensive choice is this Russian uniform green acrylic spray from Vallejo. Our next step will be to prime everything with Tamiya white primer. Before we start spraying though, we're going to do a bit of prep work. We'll mask off the shoulders of the upper blow-molded section and the lower interstage, and we'll also put all of the vernier nozzles pointing up on some double-sided tape on a piece of scrap cardboard, as well as the cap for the lower interstage. The escape tower assembly and the interstage parts are attached to scrap wood handling sticks. We're almost ready to prime. I'm going to take a moment to wipe everything off with a tack cloth. Catch any stray dust. Doesn't take much at all. Those parts are ready to go. We're using Tamiya white primer here, and we're spraying it on in long, even strokes. Now this primer is different from the Rust-Oleum gray primer that we used on the paper core tube. That was a high solids primer intended to fill in the spiral marks on that part. The Tamiya primer, on the other hand, is a thin product that won't soften or obscure the detail on the plastic parts, and will also provide a quality surface for our paint coats to latch onto. The strap-on boosters are a bit of a pain in the butt to prime, as there is nowhere for a holding stick, so we'll just prime these one end at a time. So with a primed set of components, here's the sequence we're going to use for paint application. We'll start with white for the upper Soyuz spacecraft fairing as well as the escape tower. Next, we'll mask and paint the orange at the base of the first and second stages, as well as the base of the strap-on boosters. Once that cures, we'll mask the silver areas at the base of the stages and the strap-on boosters. Then we'll mask and paint the gray-green bits using the custom color we mixed earlier. We'll finish our painting by focusing on the details, such as the red for the nozzles and the earth tone on the escape tower nozzles. And finally, we'll apply the markings. Now, this is not the decal or decal sheet that will be included in the kit. The kit will include a professionally printed silk screen decal set. This is just an interim set of markings printed for development purposes. We're back in our paint shed, as you can tell from the shifting light and shadows. The white elements are first, including the escape tower and the spacecraft fairing, which is the upper half of the forward blow molded section. I'm using Tamiya white lacquer here and spraying everything in long strokes about 8 to 10 inches away from the surface of the components. Next, we'll move on to the orange elements, including the lower ends of the central core and the strap-on boosters. Note that I've masked off the upper parts of these just to keep everything clean. Our second stage thrust structure also needs to be painted orange. Unfortunately, I pushed this can just a bit too far, and as the paint ran out, it decided to spit on the part. This is a great opportunity to remind both viewers and myself that I am not perfect, and to show everyone how we're going to recover from this little goof. Now, we could just get a fresh can of paint and just spray over everything, and no one would be the wiser. Unfortunately, there's a bit of dimensionality to these paint spit marks. You can actually feel them, and that's something that I will always notice. So I've allowed this to cure overnight, and now we're going to use some fine sanding sticks and a few drops of water to absolve ourselves of these little sins. It's easy to do, and we go right back to spraying after that task is complete. So I'm just going to put a couple drops of water on here. I'll use my fine sanding stick. And hit the paint spit marks. We're going to use our finger more than our eye here. Okay, that's pretty good. I'll put another drop of water on there. We'll go to the extra fine sanding stick now. And that's all we need to do. I'll wipe that off. And we're ready to go back to spraying. With our goof repaired, we can continue spraying the second stage thrust structure, and we'll end up ultimately with the equivalent of about 3 coats of lacquer. Note that we're not spraying the aft surface of this element. That will get masked and sprayed with metallic silver in a bit. On our forward blow molded element, the orange extends from this line forward onto the second stage to a point about 3/4 up from the base of these cable raceway details. Now, because we'll be adding the gray-green acrylic over this later, roughly in this area, and it's far easier to mask for an acrylic paint line than a lacquer line, we're going to mask the orange demarcation line just ahead of these details. It'll make sense in a little bit. Since we're masking to an arbitrary line, I'm going to place the tape just aft of this raised detail right here. I'm using 18mm Tamiya tape. I've also got the model on this towel for protection. Since we've got painted surfaces here now, I don't want to damage anything. Again, this is just an arbitrary line. We don't need to be real neat with this. I'm actually going to put some additional tape in near these cable raceways using 10mm tape here. Next, we'll tuck this into an overspray mask bag. And I'll just use some inexpensive green tape that I've got just off screen to anchor that into place. We'll take that out to the paint shed and paint it orange. Just like before, the orange goes on in light strokes about 8 to 10 inches away from the part. Be sure to get some paint on the underside of the lip that will join the second stage thrust structure. We've allowed the orange paint to cure for a few days, and our next step will be to mask and paint the metallic silver on the thrust structures. Now, this is admittedly a tricky mask job, and we'll need some help from a template provided with the kit. This template shows where the silver should be applied, and the idea is that you simply mask around this. Now, because I can't leave well enough alone, I decided to use that drawing as the basis to make a custom template for the masking tape itself, and came up with this in Adobe Illustrator. I'll cut this out and tape it over some strips of Tamiya masking tape that we've applied onto a cutting mat. With a fresh blade, we can cut this out very carefully. I'll put a little mark at the top of the dotted line that will line up with the mounting hole that's hidden on the back of the booster. I've found it's easiest to start with the curved section, taking care that the alignment mark lines up with the mounting hole. We can then add some additional pieces of tape to finish out the mask job. We'll take care to mask around the little shroud details, as they're going to be silver also. Add an overspray mask, do this 3 more times, and we're ready to paint. The aft bulkhead on our second stage thrust structure has also been masked for silver. This was a relatively simple mask job, just a couple of strips of Tamiya tape aligned with the aft end of the structure. I've also masked the aft end of the first stage core, which was a little bit more involved. This photo I snapped in the integration facility at Baikonur was certainly helpful in guiding that task. At this point, we're also going to paint the vernier nozzles and the static display nozzles with silver. We'll also take this opportunity to paint the motor retainer black. While we're on the subject, our approach to the silver is going to be a bit counterintuitive. We're going to put base coats of black down on the silver areas first. Now, the theory is that the black undercoat will make the silver color appear a bit deeper and more vibrant. It's an optional step, and if you'd like to simply spray the final color, that's not a problem. In this dojo, though, we're willing to take the extra step, and it only adds a few extra minutes. We don't even need to let the black cure completely first. Just 7 to 10 minutes for the solvents to flash off before we can add the silver overcoat. We'll do 2 coats of black followed by 2 coats of silver. We are back in our palatial paint shed and the first coats of black are going on. These are both light coats and we're allowing about 7 to 10 minutes between each coat for the solvents to flash off. After the second black coat flashes off, we can move immediately to the silver overcoat. 2 coats of the silver, which is actually a gloss aluminum, are sprayed onto our parts. All of these coats are being done with the spray nozzle about 8 to 10 inches from the part. Note how the gloss aluminum sparkles in the sunlight. Most metallic paints actually have powdered metal suspended in the mix. All of the masking materials from the orange coats have been removed and everything looks fantastic at this point. Our next color coat will be the distinctive gray-green color, so we'll need to mask for that. We'll start with the aft end of the upper section. Our mask line needs to be about 3/4 of the way forward from the base of these raceway details. If we measure from the lip on the part, we find that that puts the line about 10 millimeters ahead from this point. Conveniently, our medium masking tape is 10 millimeters wide. You'll notice that I use a bunch of Tamiya products when I build. Now, it's not that I have a promotional deal with them or anything like that, but the bottom line is that their stuff really works well, it's readily available, and their products have never, ever failed me. You might also notice that I do use some other products from other manufacturers from time to time, like the Rust-Oleum Auto Primer we used early on, the Zap CA adhesives and epoxy adhesives, or the inkjet decal film from bare metal foil that we're going to use in a bit. But the bottom line is the Tamiya stuff is great, especially on a project like this that destroys the line between traditional model rocket kits and the best plastic model kits in the world, which unsurprisingly come from Tamiya. Now, if they do want to do a promo deal with me, yeah, I'll take that phone call. On the strap-on side boosters, we need to get paint down into this gap or opening here. So when we place the tape, we're going to leave that exposed. We'll do that 3 more times. Our lower central core also needs to be masked off. We'll place this mask about 6 millimeters below the mounting supports for the strap-on boosters and then put an overspray mask in place. Before we begin painting the gray-green color, we have one more pre-assembly task to complete. We're going to glue the Interstage truss assembly onto the cap that sits atop the lower central core, as they're both going to get sprayed with the gray-green. We'll use 5-minute epoxy for this step, carefully placing tiny amounts of the adhesive into each of the little holes on the cap. Next, the truss will be put in place. And then we're going to dry fit the second stage thrust assembly on top of that, essentially using it as a tool to provide even pressure on the epoxy joints. We're not gluing the thrust structure in place at this point. We're just using it as a tool. It's a good idea to do a dry run of this a few times before adding any adhesive, just to make sure that you're clear on the process. Let's get started. I've mixed up some 5-minute epoxy, and we're going to use a sliver of toothpick to apply tiny dots of this adhesive down into each of the 12 mounting holes. I'm going to use a soft cloth to wipe off any excess that may have come up. Next, we'll move the truss into place. Carefully dropping it down into the holes. And then I'm going to fit the thrust structure on top of that. Again, no adhesive has been placed on the thrust structure. I'm just using it as a tool at this point. And for the next 5 minutes, I'm just going to chill and keep gentle pressure on the assembly. Okay, it's 5 minutes later. We can pull the upper piece off, and this lower section is ready for paint. Now here's a good question. Why don't we just go ahead and glue all of this together? Well, the reason's pretty simple. We're going to need to put a bolt in place to hold the Interstage truss together. And we won't be able to access it if this is in place. So we'll get all of these painted. These will get painted green, and of course the red will be painted on the inside of the nozzles. Once that's all done, then we can bring everything together with the bolt. Let's start spraying some paint. Now, this is not going to be an airbrush tutorial. If you'd like a quick overview of the process, please go take a look at episode number 11 of my earlier Saturn V series, where we mask and paint the roll pattern on the model. Briefly, we'll be using the custom color we mixed from Tamiya acrylics earlier, thinned 1:1 with the Tamiya thinner. I'll be using a Pache SI single action airbrush with a medium tip, and my compressor is set for about 15 pounds of pressure. Our airbrush is loaded up with paint, and the process has started. The big bullet points to note here are that the paint is going on in very thin layers, and that this is nothing like using a spray can. Also, note that the airbrush is being held perpendicular to the surface of the part, and that the nozzle is about 4 to 5 inches away. One big difference between airbrush and spray can application is the wide difference in spray pressures. Paint generally exits a spray can at about 80 pounds per square inch. That's a lot of pressure. That means the possibility of masking errors is much higher with a rattle can, as that paint will be looking for every little nook, cranny, crevice, or wrinkle in your tape job. Now that can still happen with the lower pressures that airbrushes use, but the consequences are much lower. One more thing to take into consideration is the fragility of the painted surface. With lacquers or enamels, the paint surface will be almost bulletproof once everything cures. A typical acrylic surface, on the other hand, will be much more fragile, which is why we'll be covering it up with a clear lacquer finish once construction is complete and the decals are in place. This is going to go on for a while, so enjoy the gentle mix of the airbrush compressor combined with some vaguely Russian techno-folk music, and I'll be back to ease you out of your ASMR trance in just a little bit. Our major components are off screen, allowing the paint to cure, so we can now turn our attention to painting some of the detail parts, such as these elements of the Interstage assembly, which we'll spray with the very same gray-green. These are the grid fins that will eventually be located on the Soyuz spacecraft fairing, and they're still attached to the cardboard we used for priming them. Now we'll need to paint these white, and the simple way to do that would be to just use the same color that we used for the fairing. We've got an opportunity to do something a bit different though, and that is to use a slightly different shade of white to create some additional contrast or interest so that things don't look quite so monolithic. Now we still want things to remain both accurate and realistic, so we can't go nuts here. Here's a photo of the TMA-8 round on the pad at Baikonur, and we can see that the grid fins have a slightly warmer white shade, perhaps because the picture was taken during golden hour when the sun was lower in the sky. Here's a warmer white spray lacquer that we can try, a shade called Racing White. We're going to give it a shot, and if it doesn't work, we can always repaint. We're back in the paint booth spraying the Racing White lacquer. A couple of coats should be plenty over the white primer that's already in place. The lacquer is cured for a few hours, so let's see how it looks in place on the spacecraft fairing. And that contrast looks great. Now we're not going to install these yet. We'll need to apply all of the decals first, as these will actually fit over or very close to some of those markings. Next, let's paint the interior of the rocket motor nozzles red. Now here are the static display nozzles that I've already painted with classic Testors red enamel using a small brush. When I moved to the rim, I used an even smaller brush. I'll demo this with the nozzles on the second stage thrust structure. These will be largely hidden between the stages, so this is a great place to refine our technique. I am using magnification here. Next, we'll paint one of the vernier nozzles. Now I'm going to paint the rim. I'll do that 3 more times for the other 3 sets of nozzles. We're done painting the nozzles on the second stage thrust structure. We'll let that dry and we'll be able to put together the whole Interstage assembly. We're going to paint the first of the strap-on boosters now. This is a little clunkier as we can't stand the part up to paint it. Also, note that I've placed a towel down because we don't want to damage the acrylic paint here. I'll repeat that 3 more times for this booster and then do the same thing on the other boosters. With the big nozzles out of the way, we need to take care of the ends of the vernier nozzles. This is a quick little task that is far easier than painting their bigger brothers. After looking at the nozzles on the escape tower, I decided that it would probably be better to airbrush the color on instead of hand painting or brush painting as I planned earlier. The next time I tackle one of these models, I'll probably leave the little nozzle parts off, paint them, and then install them in place. For now though, I've gone ahead and put a bunch of tiny pieces of masking tape in place. Next, we're going to use a material called parafilm. Now, this is a stretchable, wax-based film that's used in lab applications. And years ago, someone figured out that it's a great masking material for acrylic paints. As a word of warning, you would never want to use this with any paint with a volatile solvent base like lacquer or enamel. Ask me how I know next time you see me. The reason the parafilm is so ideal here is because we can snake it under the nozzles and it even sticks to itself. I'll anchor it on the part. I'll need to get another piece to mask off this upper section. And we're ready to paint. We're going to paint these nozzles with a medium tan color, as that appears to be a pretty good match for our reference photos. I strongly suspect that the actual nozzles on the Soyuz are coated in some sort of phenolic material, which tend to be warm in color. Now I've mixed up a custom color for this, which is about 20 parts desert yellow to 1 part flat red. The masking materials are off and the nozzles look fantastic. You can see here how much simpler it would have been to simply paint these before they were installed. Most of the surface of each fin is actually the same gray-green color as the main airframe section, and the base is going to remain this orange color. Fortunately, the base is exactly 3 millimeters wide. So I'm going to take some 3 millimeter wide tape and mask off the base. Now you can purchase 3 millimeter tape pre-made, or you can slice it yourself. The choice is yours. I'm going to drop this into place. I'll trim off a little bit of the excess. And I'll enlarge the mask area at the base with some Tamiya tape. Finally, we'll drop an overspray mask into place and we're ready to paint. We'll do this 3 more times and then all 4 boosters will be ready to unmask. At this point, all of our painting is done and we need to turn our attention to the decals. Again, these are not the final decals. The set provided with the kit will feature the same graphics, but will be professionally printed silkscreen decals. The critical thing here is that the water slide markings should ideally be applied to a glossy surface. Most of our markings will go onto the white spacecraft fairing, which is already a glossy surface. The progress markings, those are these turquoise markings over here, all go onto the gray-green areas, which are a matte surface. So what do we do about that? Well, we're going to hit the appropriate areas on the gray-green assemblies, specifically the central core and the 4 strap-on boosters, with a clear gloss finish to make sure that our decals go on smoothly. Now, we don't need to spray the entire assembly. All we need to do is spray the areas where the decals will be applied. On the strap-on boosters, that is going to be the area just below this interstage section and above the thrust structure, right in here in line with the fin. On the central core, we need to spray an area roughly 3 inches below the forward edge, but ahead of these mounts on two sides. One side will be where this cable raceway is, right in this area, and the other area is 180 degrees out of phase with that. This is an easy spray job, just a few passes on each of the locations. We'll need to hit the decal locations on all 4 boosters in both sides of the central core. After the decals are in place and dry, we'll even everything back out again by spraying each of these assemblies with a matte or satin overcoat. The next thing we need to do is get our interstage structure assembled. Now, getting everything in alignment here is critical. We want to make sure that all of the details on the lower section of our Soyuz line up with the correct bits of the upper section. We'll start by snapping these 2 elements together. They're keyed. There's only one way they fit together. As a reminder, we don't want to glue these yet because we still need to add the nut and bolt through that hole to hold everything together. If they were glued, we wouldn't be able to access the lower section to tighten those up. Note that this assembly has this cable raceway detail right here. I'll mark it with a little bit of tape so that it shows up better on camera. Next, note that the thrust structure of the second stage has a slot on the interior surface right here. We're going to mark that on the outside of that part with a piece of tape as well. When these 2 assemblies are correctly aligned, the thrust structure slot, which we've marked with that tape, will be 1 1/2 V details from this detail right here. There's 1 V and there's a 1/2 a V. We can even put another piece of tape right here to make that even more clear. I'll take this tape off now. When we bring all of this together with epoxy, it's going to go together like that. This detail will be here, the slot will be here. Once you're completely comfortable with the correct alignment, we can place tiny drops of epoxy into the truss holes of the second stage thrust structure and then glue everything together. After the 2 parts come together, we'll keep gentle pressure on it for a few moments until the epoxy sets up. After the epoxy sets up, we can separate the shoulder from the cap and put the nut and bolt in place. Now, if you want to get fussy, proper aerospace assembly technique says the bolt should go in the forward bit and the nut should be attached on the bottom. Just snug this down lightly. We don't want to over tighten and possibly damage the truss component. Glue the shoulder back onto the cap and this assembly is complete. We'll attach it onto the bottom of the upper blow molded component once our decals are in place. Let's get started on our decal installation. Now, this won't be an exhaustive tutorial on decal application, but we'll go over the main points. If you'd like an in-depth overview of the decal process, check out episode 13 of my Saturn V build series, which goes deep on the subject. We're going to start with the Progress logos on the lower central core and strap-on boosters. These markings feature the logo of the Progress Rocket and Space Center, which is a division of the Roscosmos organization. Roscosmos is roughly analogous to NASA in the US. Progress is the part of Roscosmos that builds the Soyuz boosters at a factory in Samara, a city in Russia roughly 1,000 kilometers southeast of Moscow. We'll start by cutting the markings from the decal sheet. Again, these have been printed on inkjet decal paper, and the markings provided with the kit will be professionally produced silkscreen decals. I'll drop the marking in some lukewarm water, then coat the installation spot on the model with some microscale microset, which is a decal setting solution designed to improve adhesion of the marking. After about 30 seconds, we should be able to gently move the decal off of the backing paper onto the location on the model. Once we're satisfied with the positioning, which is centered on the fin just below the intertank band, we can wick away some of the excess water with the corner of a soft tissue. We can also brush on some microsol decal solvent to help the marking conform with the panel line underneath. On the upper central core, one of the progress markings will go on the side opposite the cable raceway. Wait until that marking is completely dry before installing the one on the opposite side, as we don't want to mess up a decal while it's still wet. This marking goes directly over the cable raceway, and because the geometry here is so complex, I had to bring out the big gun of decal solvents, Walther's Solvaset. This is the stuff you use when the detail over which you're applying a decal is really deep or very detailed. Now, in the midst of filming, we've had a pretty big development off screen as a copy of the silkscreen decals that will be provided with the kit have arrived. These look fantastic, and there are a couple of changes from the pre-production artwork that we've used to this point. First, 4 of the progress logos are slightly smaller than the ones we've already installed. Because there are 4 of these, that means that the smaller markings are intended for the strap-on side boosters, and that the larger ones, these 2 here, are intended for the sides of the lower central core. Now, are we going to redo the ones on our boosters? No, that's going to be our little secret. The next change is that the art department at Estes has drawn a much better match for the vertical Soyuz TMA marking than the version I cobbled together. We're going to go with their version. Let's work on the decals for the pointy end of our model. Now, there are a lot of markings that will go onto a very limited amount of real estate here, and we want to make sure that we get them all in the correct location. Now, the kit will come with plenty of info on how to place everything, but that guidance doesn't exist for our pre-production model quite yet, so we're on our own. I've printed out some photos of the forward end of the Soyuz round we're building, and I've also done a simple drawing of the surface of the spacecraft fairing and printed some paper copies of our markings. Using the photos as a guide, I've built this nifty map of where everything goes. Note that all of these markings repeat twice around the fairing. At this point, we have our decal set, the decal map I've developed, the part that we're going to apply the decals onto, and I've also got one of the final production version parts of the upper section. And I'd like to point out a difference here. On the pre-production version, I have 2 circumferential details that I'm going to have to fit these decals over. The final production version that will be in the kit that you receive does not have those details. So I'm going to have to do some magic, basically, to get these decals to lay over these circumferential bits. And I'm going to use decal softener to do that. We'll start with the flag markings, and we're going to install them one at a time. I'm going to begin with one of the Brazilian flags, because it has some readily identifiable landmarks on the model where we can install it. I have decal water just off screen, and our target for this, according to our map, is above the 2 cable raceways, below the thrusters, with the left edge of the flag just under the center of the left thruster. So it's going to go right here. It'll tuck right up under the thrusters. I'll put some additional moisture on here. This is just decal water right here. On the Brazilian flags, make sure you get them going the right way. The arc on the earth on the flag curves down. It's real easy to get wrong. I'm now going to use some microsol softening agent on there. You just brush it on and then do nothing. Just let it work. This may take a while, but we're patient. The solvent has had time to work and dry, and the decal has conformed very nicely with this detail. We're going to rotate the model 180 degrees and put the second Brazil flag in the exact same spot on the other side of the model. The decal solvent has had the opportunity to work overnight, and these markings look fantastic, just like paint. Our next step will be to place the US and Russian flags between these. We'll probably install both at the same time. Now, when you place the Russian flag, make sure that the white field is forward or up. For whatever reason, I see a lot of Russian flags installed upside down. I think it's off-putting to some people that the white is at the top. I'm going to add some microsol solvent to both of these. And we'll allow the solvent to work. The decal softening, setting, solvent, solution, whatever, has done its magic on this side of the airframe. So we're going to flip it over and put the flags on this side. Again, we'll let the solvent do its job. All of our flag markings are in place and dry, and now it's time to install the Roscosmos logos. Now, Roscosmos is roughly analogous to NASA. It is the Russian National Space Agency. These will be installed below the Russian flag, centered above one of the grid fins. And I'm just going to drop a grid fin in place here to check. It will fit just above the mounting point on the grid fin and just below this circumferential detail. While we wait for the Roscosmos logo to dry, we can move down the fairing and very carefully install the Energia logo. Now, if Roscosmos is the equivalent of NASA, Energia is roughly the equivalent of NASA's Manned Space Center. This is the part of the Russian space program where all crewed activities are run from. It's going to be centered in line with the Roscosmos logo and the grid fin, just above the midpoint of this section of the fairing. So right about there. The bottom edge of the red line in the Energia logo will be roughly in line with this cover here. Our Russian logos are almost dry, so let's rotate this 90 degrees and install the Brazilian logos. I'll drop the grid fin in place just for spacing purposes. This first one is the Brazilian Space Agency, and it will go just below this dimensional break in the fairing, and then the mission logo will go just below that. Let's get started. The Brazilian markings have settled down enough for us to move on. And the next thing to do is to install the Soyuz TMA marking. Now this is going to go below the US flag, as close to the edge of the grid fin as we can get it without interfering with the grid fin. Another way to look at this is it is not centered between the two mounting holes for the grid fin, but rather pushed off to the left. And with that, all of our markings on this side of the fairing are complete. Next, we'll flip the fairing 180 degrees and duplicate all of these one more time. We'll do that off of camera. All of our markings are in place and our end goal is in sight. Now, before we start bringing all of these elements together, we need to put some sort of uniform clear finish on everything. You'll recall that we sprayed some gloss on the boosters and on the central core so that we would have a smooth surface for our decals. So now we need to bring those assemblies back to something more consistent. If we take a look at our photos of this particular Soyuz round, we can see that there's some evidence of a slightly glossy surface on everything. Now, it's not a hard automotive gloss, but some sort of semi-gloss would be entirely appropriate. For that, we're going to use Tamiya Semi-Gloss Clear Lacquer. It'll go on just like the spray lacquers we've used up to this point, and it'll even give our acrylic paint surfaces a bit of protection. As an added bonus, it will even give the decals more of a uniform paint-like look. We are back in our improvised paint booth, and the Semi-Gloss Clear is going onto the parts just like all of the other spray lacquers we've used, in long, even coats with the can about 8 to 10 inches away from the part. After 2 coats of the clear, we'll let the parts cure overnight. You'll come across a great deal of advice not to use lacquers over decals. While I am not a chemist, I suspect that it works here because the Tamiya products are a synthetic formulation with a fairly benign solvent, not an organic lacquer with a volatile solvent. I've never had any difficulty with these paints damaging any plastic, decal, or other type of paint. Our semi-gloss clear finish is dried overnight, and now we can get going with final assembly. We're going to start by putting the grid fins onto the upper section of our model. Now, the forward end of each grid fin will fit into the hole on the spacecraft fairing. Now, if we flip the grid fin over, you'll find a small circular pad, which will also be a joint between the two parts. These will be installed with liquid plastic cement with the understanding that the stuff doesn't stick well to paint. We'll need to gently clear the paint from the mounting hole with a drill, and we'll also need to clear the paint from the spot where the pad will make contact, about 12 millimeters below the mounting hole. I'll use an X-Acto blade to clear that spot. This is where the pad on the back of the grid fin will make contact with the fairing. Now the alignment here is critical, and we only have our eyeball to guide us. We'll need to repeat this 3 more times for the other grid fins. Let's bring together the upper blow molded section and the second stage thrust structure interstage assembly. Note that there's only one way that these fit together. Fortunately, there's a key and slot arrangement here to help make getting everything aligned properly. I've highlighted both of them in black. Take some time to make sure you understand exactly how those are supposed to fit together. Once we're comfortable with the fit, we can use a popsicle stick to spread a thin film of 5-minute epoxy on the inside of the thrust structure and bring everything together. The epoxy at the aft end has had some time to cure, so now we can check the fit of the escape tower to the upper spacecraft fairing. There's also a key and slot arrangement here as well. So there's only one way for this to fit together. I'll just rotate that, it'll click down into place. That's the alignment that we want. I'll mix up a bit of epoxy. I'll gently spread this inside the aft skirt on the escape tower. Line up the key and slot. And then I'll need to hold this until everything sets up. See you in about 10 minutes. Let's get the components at the aft end of our Soyuz ready for assembly. We'll need to clear the paint from some of the contact spots on both the central core and the boosters, starting with the central core. Now on each booster position there are 3 contact points. The first is a tiny spot in the center of the butterfly, the forward mount. The next is this contact pad, and the final one is this aft mount position. We'll use the edge of a small file to clear the center of the butterfly. Carefully work it until you can see a bit of plastic. Again, the adhesives work on plastic, not on paint. Almost there. Now the central pad, we're going to work with a sanding stick. Now we really want to make sure that we get all the way through the primer down to the actual raw plastic. That looks good. Now this aft one, we can also use a sanding stick. Next, we'll locate the length of plastic rod that was attached to one of the kit sprues. Now, if this has gone missing, you can substitute a bit of styrene rod in the neighborhood of 0.50 to 0.60 inch diameter. Now, I have the original part here, but I'm going to use the styrene rod because the white color will show up better on the camera. We're going to cut this into 4 pieces, each about 3/8 of an inch in diameter. The length really isn't that critical. These will go into the holes that are in the aft contact pads. I'm going to grab a drill real quick. These will go into the aft contact pads, and will match up with holes hidden in the backside of the boosters. I'm going to hit that with a tiny bit of liquid cement. I'll repeat that 3 more times all the way around the central core. Let's move on to our strap-on boosters and get them ready for installation. Now, just like the central core, there are 3 places where we need to sand down to bare plastic so that our adhesives behave properly. The first 2 are easy. A bit of light sanding on the back of the forward tip will expose some bare gray plastic that will meet up with the butterfly on the central core. Our tiny jeweler's file can be used in the gap on either side of the mounting hole at the aft end of each booster, clearing about a ½ inch on either side of the locator hole. The third spot is a bit trickier. Holding the booster in place against the central core, locate the spot where the central pad contacts the backside of the booster. Using a pencil, draw a short line on the booster at this location, right along the mounting pad. When we remove the booster from the core, we can see the pencil line that defines the contact location. Since it's tough to see here, I'll add a short piece of tape along that line. Send a line about 3/4 of an inch long between the tape and the cable raceway. It's a good idea to install the vernier motors at this point. The official kit instructions arrived a couple of days ago and informed me that I should have installed these when the exterior shroud parts were glued into place. Because of that, I'll need to sand the shoulders of the vernier motors to kind of persuade them into position. Once they're in place, I'll add a drop of thin cement at the base and then touch up any visible sanding marks with a bit of silver enamel paint. We've reached a bit of a milestone here. It's time to install our strap-on boosters onto the central core. Now, the kit instructions advise using CA adhesive for this step, but I'm going to try to steer you in a different direction. CA adhesives are best kept away from any surface that has already been painted, like our booster and our central core assemblies. While CA glues set up quickly, they actually take hours to cure completely. As they cure, they continue to release a vapor fog of uncured adhesive. Now, that fog can creep onto our painted surface and leave an unsightly haze that we can only get rid of by sanding and repainting. So, no super glue or variants on this particular step for this model. Instead, we're going to use a thin film of tube-type plastic model cement applied at the butterfly joint, the central pad, and the aft pad. If we were to use liquid plastic cement, it would simply evaporate too quickly for this particular job. I'll squeeze a bit of cement onto a card and then use a toothpick to apply a tiny bit where we need it. We'll drop the booster down into place, and then we're going to apply gentle pressure for about 10 minutes until the cement thoroughly sets up. After the cement sets up for a few minutes, I'm going to leave the assembly alone with the booster up for a couple of hours. Our first booster is in place, so let's move on to the second one. Same drill as before. One of the really nice things about this design is that everything is self-aligning. I'll just hold this in position for a few moments. Those of you who watched my Saturn V build series may recognize this cradle fashioned from a cardboard box. As our Soyuz grows, it's becoming awkward to hold in position, and this is perfect for the job. We'll just set the lower section into the cradle and add the third strap-on booster element. We'll let this cement cure for a couple of hours and then move on. And now finally, let's install our last booster element. After the cement on our final booster dries, we can twist the display nozzles into place on the central core. And this brings our Soyuz saga to a close. This has been one of the most rewarding model projects of my entire life, and I am thrilled with the result. While this model is obviously designed to fly, I am amazed that no corners were cut in the effort to make it a top-notch static display model. In fact, it may be the dual nature of this kit that makes it so surprising and so rewarding. Thanks again for watching. I sincerely look forward to what the model building community will do with this great new kit.